At some point, you stopped trusting easily. You may have told yourself it was damage, something that happened to you, something that broke a mechanism that used to work. You may have accepted, from people who found your caution inconvenient, the diagnosis that you were closed, guarded, difficult to reach. And you may have spent years trying to fix something that was never broken, trying to restore an openness that your own experience had, with extraordinary precision, taught you was costly. What they called your wound was your education. What they called your problem was your pattern recognition. And the difference between those two interpretations is the difference between a life spent trying to recover from your own perceptions and a life spent trusting them. Friedrich Nietzsche made a distinction that most of psychology has spent the last century trying to reverse. He separated what he called the reactive person, one whose internal state is governed primarily by external stimuli, who responds to the world rather than reading it, from the person of genuine awareness, who brings their full observation to bear on what is happening around them before deciding how to respond. The reactive person absorbs, the aware person assesses, and the patterns that the aware person recognizes, the behavioral signatures that repeat themselves across different people in different contexts across years of experience, are not anxiety. They are data, accumulated, verified, reliable data about how certain kinds of behavior operate. These 7 rules are for people who are done apologizing for what they have correctly noticed. They are not instructions for becoming cold. They are the philosophical confirmation of something your own experience already tried to teach you, and that certain people in your life needed you not to learn. Not cruelty, recognition. And recognition, once activated, protects what no amount of good faith ever reliably protected on its own. Before the first rule, understand where Nietzsche located the source of most human suffering. It was not, he argued, in the presence of darkness in the world. Darkness in the world is ancient and predictable, and, to anyone paying attention, thoroughly documented. The source of most avoidable human suffering, in Nietzsche's analysis, was the refusal to see darkness clearly, the preference for an interpretation of human behavior that was more comfortable than it was accurate, that required ongoing reinterpretation of evidence that had already delivered its verdict. He called this the triumph of comfort over clarity, and he spent his entire philosophical life on the other side of that choice, not in bitterness about what he found there, but in the conviction that the person who can see the full terrain of human nature, including its most calculated and predatory expressions, is not diminished by that sight. They are, for the first time, genuinely free within it. The first rule: you are not imagining the pattern. The pattern is why you noticed it. The naive belief that most perceptive people are eventually pressured into accepting is that their discomfort in the presence of certain behaviors is a projection of their own psychology, rather than an accurate reading of what is actually happening, that their instinct, the particular low-frequency signal that fires when someone's words and their behavior are not matching, when an apology is delivered without any change, when warmth is consistently deployed in advance of requests, is an artifact of their own history rather than a response to present reality. This belief is convenient for anyone whose behavior generates the signal. and it is the single most effective mechanism by which that behavior continues undisturbed. Nietzsche observed, in his analysis of what he called the herd's relationship to the exceptional individual, that the person who sees clearly is almost always pressured to doubt their own sight before they are allowed to act on it. Not because the seeing is wrong, but because what it sees is inconvenient. The political structures of every major civilization he studied followed the same internal logic. The first move against anyone who accurately described an uncomfortable reality was not to address the reality, but to question the perceiver. Call it sensitivity. Call it cynicism. Call it trust issues. The goal is always the same: to reintroduce enough doubt into the perceiver's relationship with their own observation that they pause long enough for the behavior to continue. Your pattern recognition did not develop in a vacuum. It developed in response to patterns. Every instinct you carry about a specific kind of behavior, a specific kind of person, a specific kind of dynamic, was assembled from evidence. Some of that evidence is old, some of it is ongoing, but evidence assembled into pattern is not a wound, it is a conclusion. And the person who pressures you to abandon your conclusions without providing counter-evidence is not helping you heal. They are helping themselves. The second rule: the presentation is always deliberate, and what is withheld is always more significant than what is shown. Every person who moves through social environments is, to some degree, managing how they are seen. This is not inherently manipulative. It is simply the recognition that presentation shapes reception, and that most people want to be received accurately. But Nietzsche drew a sharp distinction between presentation as an expression of genuine self and presentation as a strategic concealment of what would complicate the desired result. The first is a natural function of social life. The second is something else entirely. And the difference, he argued, becomes visible only over time, only in the gap between what someone consistently shows and what their behavior, in unguarded moments or under pressure, occasionally reveals. The pattern recognizer knows this gap. They have watched it appear in people who presented warmth while pursuing advantage, who displayed generosity while calculating debt, who offered closeness while collecting information. They know that the most polished presentations often conceal the most deliberate architecture, that the person who has thought carefully about how to be perceived has, by definition, also thought carefully about what they do not want you to see. And what they do not want you to see is precisely what your pattern recognition is looking for. Not the performance. The thing the performance is designed to obscure. In practical terms, this means attending to behavior over time more than presentation in the moment. It means noticing what changes when the stakes change, what shifts when the need shifts, what disappears from the warmth once the warmth has served its purpose. Nietzsche was clear. The most reliable information about any person is not what they offer when goodwill costs them nothing. It is what they offer when goodwill costs them something real. That is where the pattern becomes visible. And if you have been watching long enough, you already know what you have seen. The third rule: the behavior that was excused as an exception will prove itself to be the rule. How many times have you watched a pattern establish itself through the progressive reclassification of its own evidence? The first incident was excused as unusual circumstance. The second was explained by stress, by miscommunication, by your own possible misreading. By the third, a story has been constructed, collaboratively often, with the participation of your own desire to be wrong, that transforms a pattern into a series of isolated events, each with its own exculpatory narrative, none of which connects to the others in any way that would require the obvious conclusion. Nietzsche identified this mechanism as one of the most reliable features of what he called resentment, not in its speaker, but in its target. The person whose behavior is being systematically excused benefits from each successive reinterpretation. Each excuse provided is a lesson in how to produce the next excuse. Each isolated event narrative constructed around a repeated behavior teaches the person repeating it that the pattern will be dissolved rather than confronted, that their behavior exists in an interpretive environment so charitable that it functionally has no consequences. The exception becomes the rule, because every exception was treated as exceptional. And the pattern recognizer, the person whose discomfort repeatedly fired and was repeatedly suppressed, eventually arrives at the understanding their own perception was trying to deliver from the first incident onward. The law here is precise and merciless. Behavior that is excused without being addressed will recur. Not because the person is necessarily a predator, but because all behavior responds to the environment's feedback, and an environment that consistently neutralizes consequence, consistently trains behavior toward its own exploitation. The fourth rule, capability revealed without security built, is an offering to those who will use it before you are ready. The pattern recognizer has often learned this rule the hardest way available. By watching something they built, something they revealed, something they offered in good faith, get used against them in an environment that was not as safe as it appeared. They showed the depth of their thinking to someone who was cataloging weaknesses. They revealed the scope of their ambition to someone who needed to know exactly what to undermine. They demonstrated the full quality of their work to someone who needed to understand how to take credit for it. And afterward, they carried the lesson not as bitterness, but as calibration. That the environment must be assessed before the capability is displayed, and that trust in an environment must be demonstrated by that environment before it is extended to it. Nietzsche wrote about what he called the premature self-disclosure of the exceptional person as one of the consistent tragedies of human social organization. Not because disclosure is wrong, but because the social environment that surrounds exceptional capability is not neutral. It contains people who are threatened by it, and people who seek to annex it, and people who will smile warmly while determining exactly how to position themselves in relationship to it, before you have had the chance to position yourself in relationship to them. The exceptional person who reveals everything early hands the game to everyone who had the patience to wait. Build the foundation. Let the structure become visible only once it is load-bearing enough that removing it would cost more than anyone is willing to spend. The fifth rule, the person who has earned your love and the person who has earned your respect may not be the same person, and conflating them is where most of the damage begins. Of all the patterns the pattern recognizer has assembled, This one is often the most personally costly because it lives inside the relationships that matter most. It is the pattern of someone who is loved deeply and genuinely, but who has never, despite the evidence that was always available, earned the structural respect that love requires as a foundation in order not to consume itself. And the consuming, when it comes, arrives precisely because the love was real, while the respect was assumed rather than constructed. Nietzsche was among the most precise analysts of this distinction. He argued that affection, by its nature, is generated through proximity and shared experience, through the feeling of being known, chosen, understood, and it can exist in the complete absence of the behavioral consistency that generates respect. The two are not the same process. A person can know your interior completely and still not follow through on what they committed to, can be genuinely fond of you and still be fundamentally unreliable, can feel warmly toward you in every moment where warmth costs nothing, and disappear in every moment where reliability would cost something real. The pattern recognizer knows this. They have the data. And the transformation that the rule requires is simply the willingness to act on what the data says, to let the accumulated evidence of behavior determine the level of structural trust extended, regardless of the warmth that has accumulated alongside it. Love without respect is a beautiful room with no foundation, and rooms without foundations eventually collapse inward. Here is where the deepest question must be asked. Because by now, if you have been paying attention to your own response to this material, something in you has noticed a familiar dynamic, the same one that has followed you through every conversation in which you have been told that your perception is the problem. There is a version of this content that confirms your worst fears about human nature. There is another version, the one Nietzsche actually wrote, that does something more useful. It validates the perception and then offers what to do with it. The resistance that most people feel toward learning these rules directly, the discomfort, the sense that accepting this map of human behavior means accepting something irrevocably darker about the world, is itself a pattern worth recognizing. It is the discomfort of someone who has been told, by voices far closer and more personal than any philosophy, that their perception is a liability, that what they notice is damage rather than data, and the comfort of believing the world is fairer than their experience has demonstrated has functioned, for most of them, as a kind of resting state, a baseline they return to, because the alternative requires maintaining a clarity that no one in their environment has consistently supported. Nietzsche was not offering a darker world. He was offering a more honest one. And the distinction matters because the honest world, the one in which human nature is accurately mapped rather than charitably distorted, is actually easier to navigate than the fictional one, because you stop being surprised by it. You stop absorbing damage that you did not see coming. You stop carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been accommodating behavior they knew in some persistent and insistent interior register was not what it was presented as being. You stop spending your most careful attention on managing your own perception of what you are experiencing, rather than simply responding accurately to what is there. The sixth rule: the battle that is never forced is the battle you have already won by other means. The pattern recognizer has often, in their earlier responses to what they correctly perceived, chosen direct confrontation as the vehicle for resolution. They named the behavior. They documented the pattern. They presented the evidence with the careful precision of someone who had assembled it across time and wanted it to be taken seriously. And in most cases, they discovered that direct confrontation in an environment that had been operating in bad faith produces not resolution, but repositioning. The other person adjusts their presentation, provides a more sophisticated version of the original excuse, and the behavior resumes with improved concealment. Nietzsche observed that the person who fights on the terms of the environment they are fighting within has already accepted a significant disadvantage. The more effective posture, documented in every political and social power structure he analyzed, is the building of a position from which the confrontation becomes unnecessary, because the position itself has made the cost of continued bad faith behavior higher than the other party is willing to sustain. This is not avoidance. It is the deliberate construction of leverage through means other than argument. It is becoming, through the patient accumulation of position, alliance, and demonstrated quality, someone whose continued goodwill is worth more to the other party than the behavior being defended. The confrontation that never happened produced the adjustment that the confrontation never could. Elevation makes irrelevant what confrontation could only make worse. The seventh rule, and the one all the others have been building toward. The greatest protection available to the pattern recognizer is the interior that cannot be disrupted from the outside. Everything examined so far, the perception, the documentation, the strategic positioning, the careful calibration of what is revealed and when, all of it serves a single function. It protects a center, an interior stability that does not depend on the external environment being cooperative, fair, or honest. That holds its own orientation, regardless of whether the people around it behave well. That can observe the pattern clearly without being reorganized by it, can acknowledge the reality of what is happening without being destabilized by the acknowledgement. Nietzsche called this the sovereign self, not the invulnerable self which does not exist, but the self that has sufficiently internalized its own values, perceptions, and orientations that external forces can no longer simply overwrite them. The person who has built this interior is the person who can be in the presence of manipulation without becoming confused by it, who can be in the presence of bad faith without doubting their own good perception, who can watch behavior that contradicts what they were told without spending weeks finding the interpretation that makes the contradiction disappear. This is what your pattern recognition was always building toward. Not a fortress, not isolation. A self, a stable, accurately perceiving, reliably oriented self that can move through the full complexity of human social life without being fundamentally destabilized by any of it. The patterns you have assembled across every difficult experience you have ever had are not evidence of damage. They are the library of a person who paid careful attention to what the world was actually showing them. And the rules that Nietzsche built around those patterns are not a darker philosophy. They are the philosophical confirmation of what you already, at some level, already knew. You were never broken. You were learning. And what you learned is exactly what the people who called it damage needed you to forget.